I never planned to fall for a woman who smelled like hay and heartbreak. She held the reins out and said, "Trust the horse." Not me. I trusted her anyway. And that changed everything. My mother warned me love like this would cost me my family. A secret waited in the barn, older than both our hearts. The land my grandfather sold was coming back to haunt us. One phone call could burn down everything we built. I didn't know yet that saying her name would break my world open. My name is Grace Whitfield, 29. Born and raised in Chicago. A corporate lawyer who measured life in billable hours and quiet Sunday dinners with my mother. That summer I drove out to a small horse ranch near Bozeman, Montana, chasing nothing but silence. Unaware I was about to meet the woman who would undo me completely. The gravel road to Callaway Ranch stretched long and dusty, a hand-painted sign creaking on rusted chains, and something in my chest loosened the moment I saw the mountains. She stepped out of the barn in worn boots and a faded Stetson, introduced herself simply as Reese Callaway, and shook my hand like she was already deciding whether to trust me. Reese assigned me a mare named Ember, warned me the horse was stubborn, then added under her breath that stubborn things usually got along fine together. My first lesson was clumsy and terrifying, my hands shaking on the reins, while Reese stood close enough that I forgot, briefly, how to breathe normally. She guided my fingers into the correct grip, her palm rough and warm against mine, then pulled away so fast I wondered if I had imagined the moment entirely. Inside the barn office I noticed a faded photograph pinned above her desk. Reese younger and laughing beside another woman, both of them covered in trail dust and joy, at the diner in town. A waitress mentioned that Reese used to be different, her voice trailing off, and I didn't ask further, though the words stayed with me. During my second lesson I slipped from the saddle, and Reese caught me against her chest before I hit the ground, both of us frozen for one long second. Our eyes held too long that afternoon, neither of us speaking, until the ranch dog barked at nothing and gave us both an excuse to look away. I extended my stay by another week, telling my mother over the phone it was for an ongoing case, though we both knew I hadn't opened my laptop once. That evening Reese made venison stew and talked little, but she listened harder than any man I had dated in the last 5 years combined. I admitted, without meaning to, that I had come to Montana running from a canceled engagement, from a fiancé who never once made me feel the way this stranger already did. Reese's guarded expression softened for the first time since we'd met, and she said quietly, "Horses don't lie to you. People usually do." We started riding every morning before the heat set in, and I began memorizing the rhythm of her voice more than the mechanics of steering a horse. One dawn she showed me how to read a storm coming off the mountains, and I realized I was no longer thinking about Chicago, or my old life, at all. Reese never talked about herself unless I asked twice, and even then her answers arrived like carefully rationed water, precious and never quite enough. I found myself lingering in the barn after lessons ended, inventing reasons to stay, brushing Ember's coat long after the horse had stopped needing it. She caught me staring once and didn't look away, just tilted her hat back and asked if city lawyers always stared at ranch hands like that. I laughed harder than the joke deserved, mostly from relief that she had noticed me the same way I had been noticing her. During a thunderstorm we sheltered together in the tack room, shoulders pressed close, and she told me she hadn't let anyone that near in almost 3 years. I didn't push for the reason, but I filed the number away. 3 years. And wondered what had happened to make someone guard themselves so carefully. We drove into town for the 4th of July, and Reese introduced me simply as a friend, though her hand brushed mine twice on the walk to the fireworks. Under the exploding sky she finally told me about Dana, her fiancé, thrown from a horse on an icy trail 4 winters ago and never waking again. I understood then why she taught riding with such quiet reverence, why every lesson felt like an apology to someone who could no longer hear it. I reached for her hand in the dark, and for once she let me hold it, her fingers trembling slightly against mine. That night, walking back to the guest cabin, Reese stopped mid-sentence, cupped my face, and kissed me like she was terrified and certain in the same breath. I kissed her back without hesitation, my carefully ordered life in Chicago suddenly feeling like a story that belonged to someone else entirely. We didn't talk about what it meant the next morning, but she made 2 cups of coffee instead of 1, and that felt like an answer. My law firm called demanding I return for a merger case, and I told them I needed another week. Ignoring the disappointment in my supervisor's voice, Reese taught me to canter that week, laughing when I shrieked, catching me every single time I lost my balance. As though it were instinct now, I called my mother and mentioned Reese's name for the first time, careful to say the ranch owner, instead of anything that might reveal how I truly felt. My mother asked no questions, which somehow felt worse than if she had asked every question I feared. Reese showed me an old weather journal belonging to her grandmother, who had run this ranch alone after her husband left, and I saw where her strength was inherited from. I told her about my own late father, a rancher's son from Nebraska who moved to the city and never looked back, and she seemed startled by the coincidence. "Small world," she murmured, though her eyes lingered on me a beat longer than the comment required, as if something private had shifted behind them. We spent an entire Sunday repairing fence posts together, arguing playfully over hammer technique, and I realized I hadn't laughed this easily in years. That night she cooked dinner at her own house for the first time, small and cluttered with rope, saddles, and photographs she still hadn't taken down. I asked gently about Dana again, and Reese admitted she still felt like loving anyone new was a betrayal she hadn't earned forgiveness for yet. I told her love wasn't a debt to be repaid. It was a door someone eventually had to choose to walk through again. She kissed me then, slower this time, like she was finally allowing herself to want something without immediately bracing for the loss of it. Word around town started quietly. A ranch hand's knowing smile, a diner waitress who winked when she saw us arrive together for breakfast. Reese didn't flinch at the attention, but I noticed her hand withdraw slightly whenever we stepped into public places, an old caution resurfacing. I extended my leave from the firm indefinitely, using vacation days I'd hoarded for years without ever intending to spend them. My mother finally visited unannounced, arriving in a rental car with sunglasses and an expression I recognized as barely contained judgment. She met Reese at the stables, polite but stiff, her eyes cataloging every detail of the ranch like evidence in a trial. That evening my mother asked me privately if this was a phase, and something in me went cold and quiet at the question. I told her it wasn't a phase. It was the first time in my life I had felt entirely, unapologetically like myself. My mother left the next morning without saying goodbye to Reese, and the silence in the car ride to the airport said everything. Reese asked if I regretted anything, and I told her the only regret I had was not coming to Montana years sooner. A letter arrived from my law firm threatening to remove me from partnership consideration if I didn't return within the month. Reese found me staring at the letter in the barn, and instead of asking me to stay, she simply said she understood if I had to go. I hated that she offered me an easy exit instead of fighting for one, and I told her so, louder than either of us expected. "I'm not trying to make this easy," she said. "I'm trying not to become someone's excuse for staying somewhere they'll resent." We didn't speak for 2 full days, both of us circling the ranch like storm systems too proud to collide again. On the 3rd day I found her repairing a fence alone in the rain, and I picked up a hammer without a word. We worked in silence until the rain soaked through everything, and then she finally laughed, admitting she'd missed my terrible hammering technique. I told her I wasn't going back to Chicago, not permanently, and her relief was written so plainly across her face it startled me. That night she showed me the ranch's financial ledgers, admitting quietly that the last 2 winters had nearly bankrupted the whole operation. A local development company had been circling the property for months, offering to buy the land for a resort expansion project. Reese refused every offer, insisting the ranch was the only piece of Dana she had left standing in the physical world. I offered to review the contracts as a lawyer, and for the first time my old career felt like it might actually matter here. Buried in the paperwork, I recognized the developer's parent company letterhead, a name I had seen at my own family's dinner table for years. Whitfield Land Ventures, my father's company, now run by my uncle, was the entity quietly pressuring Reese to sell her grandmother's ranch. My hands went cold reading the name, and I didn't tell Reese that night, needing time to understand what this actually meant. I called my uncle the next morning, voice shaking, demanding to know why Whitfield Land Ventures was targeting a ranch in Montana at all. My uncle laughed it off, calling it just business, and reminded me my mother had personally approved the expansion research months earlier. I confronted my mother by phone, and her long silence told me she had known exactly whose ranch this was the entire time. I didn't know you'd fall in love with her, my mother finally admitted. I only wanted you far from that life, whatever it looked like. The betrayal cut sharper than I expected, not because of the land, but because she had used my own family's money to threaten it. I told Reese everything that night, watching her expression shift from confusion to hurt to something colder I hadn't seen from her before. You knew, she said. Not a question. And I told her I hadn't known until the papers were already in my hands. She asked me to leave the house for a few hours, needing space. And I didn't argue, though it felt like losing solid ground beneath me. I drove into town and sat alone at the diner, the same waitress from my first week sliding coffee toward me without a word. She's been hurt before, the waitress said quietly. Give her room. Not answer she's not ready to hear yet. I returned to the ranch at dusk and found Reese sitting on the porch, staring at the mountains like she was memorizing them for goodbye. If this ranch disappears, she said, the last place Dana ever felt safe disappears with it. And I can't let your family be the reason. I promised her I would stop the sale, even if it meant confronting my mother and uncle directly, even if it cost me everything at the firm. My firm called again, this time offering an ultimatum: return immediately or lose the partnership track I had spent 7 years building. Reese overheard the call and told me not to sacrifice my career for her, that she refused to be another thing people gave up for her sake. I told her this wasn't sacrifice, it was choice. And there was a difference she needed to start believing in. The town's gossip sharpened into something crueler. A flyer appeared at the feed store questioning, what's really going on out at Callaway Ranch? Reese's oldest ranch hand, Walt, confronted her about it, and I braced myself for betrayal, certain he intended to spread rumors further. Instead, Walt admitted he'd torn the flyer down himself, saying he'd known about Dana and Reese for years and never once cared who she loved. I warned you both because trouble's coming, Walt said. Not because I'm the one bringing it. So stop looking at me like I'm the enemy. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by guilt for assuming the worst of someone who had quietly protected us all along. My ex-fiancé, David, called out of nowhere, having heard rumors through mutual friends, offering to help me sort my head out in Chicago. I told him plainly there was nothing left to sort out, that I had never felt more certain of anything in my life. Reese grew distant after learning about David's call, old fears resurfacing that I might still choose the safer, more familiar life waiting back home. I'm not going anywhere, I told her, but the words felt thin against the weight of everything threatening to pull us apart. The developer's lawyer arrived at the ranch with a formal buyout offer, doubled from the original amount, clearly meant to be impossible to refuse. Reese asked for time to think, and I watched something harden behind her eyes, the old grief mixing dangerously with new exhaustion. That night she told me maybe it would be easier for everyone if she just sold the ranch and let this entire mess end quietly. I begged her not to give up, reminding her the ranch wasn't only about Dana anymore. It was about the life we were building together now. What if there's no us to build toward? She snapped. What if your family keeps circling until there's nothing left standing between us? We fought harder that night than we ever had, old wounds and new fears colliding until she asked me to give her space again. I stayed in town that night, staring at the ceiling of a cheap motel, wondering if I had brought nothing but destruction to her door. My phone buzzed at midnight, My mother finally calling. Her voice uncharacteristically soft, saying we needed to talk face to face. I drove to meet her at a diner outside town, bracing for another lecture. Another attempt to reroute my life back onto her chosen path. Instead, my mother slid an old photograph across the table. Herself as a young woman standing beside another woman I didn't recognize at all. Her name was Louise, my mother said quietly. We were inseparable in college. Until I chose the version of my life that seemed safer. I sat frozen, hearing my own fears reflected back at me through a story I never knew belonged to my mother at all. I've spent 30 years wondering what my life would have looked like, she admitted. I don't want that same regret written into yours. The development deal, she confessed, had been her attempt to force me back to Chicago before I made the same choice she once walked away from. I was wrong, she said. And I can fix the ranch situation. If you're certain this is the life you actually want. I told her, without hesitation, that I had never been more certain of anything. And for the first time in years she simply nodded. I drove straight back to Callaway Ranch, desperate to tell Reese everything before the weight of the secret crushed something irreparable between us. Reese wasn't at the house. And Walt told me she'd ridden out toward the ridge alone hours earlier, upset and unreachable by phone. A storm was building fast over the mountains, the same kind of storm that had taken Dana from her years before this one. Fear seized my chest as I saddled Ember myself, hands shaking, determined to find Reese before the weather turned dangerous around her. I rode harder than I ever had, rain lashing sideways, calling her name into wind that seemed determined to swallow every word. I found her at the ridge overlook, soaked and shivering, staring down at the property like she was already saying goodbye to it. I can't lose this place the way I lost her, Reese shouted over the wind. And I don't know how to lose you either. You're not losing anything, I shouted back. My mother is stopping the sale, and I am not leaving this ranch. Are you? Ever? Lightning cracked somewhere close, and Ember reared in fear, throwing me hard against the muddy ground before Reese could reach me. Reese was at my side instantly, checking for injuries with trembling hands, terror and love colliding openly across her rain-soaked face. Don't you dare scare me like that, she said, half sobbing, pulling me upright and holding on like she never intended to let go again. We rode back together in silence, exhausted and drenched, but something between us had settled into place with unshakable certainty. The following morning, my mother's lawyer called to confirm Whitfield Land Ventures was formally withdrawing its offer on the Callaway property. Reese read the confirmation letter twice, then sat down heavily on the porch steps, relief and disbelief moving across her face together. It's really over, she whispered, and I sat beside her, promising this was only the beginning of everything else we still had left to build. Word spread through town quickly, and instead of gossip, neighbors began arriving with casseroles, lumber, and offers to help rebuild the damaged east fence. Walt organized a work crew without being asked, saying the ranch had survived worse than gossip and would survive this too. Together, I called my law firm and formally resigned from the partnership track, choosing instead to open a small practice serving ranchers across the county. My old colleagues called it career suicide, but for the first time in years, my decisions felt entirely, unmistakably my own. Reese and I began renovating the guest cabin into a permanent home, choosing paint colors and furniture like people building an actual future together. We found more of Dana's belongings while clearing space, and instead of pain, Reese spoke about her with warmth I hadn't heard before. She'd have liked you, Reese said one evening. She always said I needed someone who wouldn't let me hide behind this ranch forever. I told her I had no intention of letting her hide from anything, least of all the life quietly building itself around us. My mother visited again, this time staying 3 full days, learning to muck stalls badly and laughing at herself more than I'd seen in years. She and Reese found unexpected common ground over old ranching stories, my mother's guarded exterior slowly softening around someone who reminded her of Louise. One evening my mother pulled me aside and apologized properly, admitting fear had driven every decision she made trying to control my path. "I'm proud of you," she said. Words I hadn't heard from her in over a decade, and I let myself believe them fully. The town held its annual harvest festival, and for the first time Reese and I attended openly as a couple, hand in hand. A few disapproving looks lingered near the punch bowl, but far more neighbors simply nodded, greeted us, and moved on with their evenings. Walt gave a toast that night, calling Reese the strongest rancher he'd ever worked under, and calling me the best thing to happen to this place. I cried harder than I expected, surrounded by people who had somehow become family faster than I ever imagined possible. Reese pulled me aside beneath the string lights and admitted she hadn't planned on loving anyone else again after Dana. "Not really." "But you didn't ask me to replace her," Reese said. "You just made room for both of you to exist in my life at once." I told her that was the only kind of love I ever wanted to offer anyone. Room instead of erasure. Patience instead of pressure. We returned to the ranch late that night, exhausted and happy, watching the same mountains that had witnessed every hard conversation between us. Winter arrived fast that year, and I learned to break ice from water troughs, my lawyer's hands finally earning real calluses of their own. Reese taught me to read the horses' moods before entering their stalls, patience becoming a language I hadn't realized I was fluent in now. My mother sent care packages from Chicago, small things, gloves and coffee, gestures that spoke louder than any of her previous silences ever had. Reese's aunt, her only surviving relative, visited for Christmas, studying me carefully before finally declaring I had decent enough hands for ranch work. I laughed, understanding it was the highest compliment the woman was capable of giving anyone on short notice. One snowy evening Reese handed me a small wooden box. Inside it a ring fashioned from an old horseshoe nail. Simple and unmistakably hers. "I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow," she said. "I'm asking you to let this mean we're building something permanent. Together." I slid the ring on immediately, telling her permanence was the only thing I wanted since the moment she caught me falling from that saddle. Word of our engagement reached my uncle, who sent a brief, cold congratulations that neither of us expected nor particularly needed anymore. My mother, by contrast, offered to help plan a small spring wedding at the ranch, an offer that still occasionally surprised me completely. Reese worried about inviting the whole town, afraid of judgment resurfacing right when everything finally felt settled and safe again. I reminded her the same town that once whispered rumors had shown up with lumber and casseroles the moment we truly needed them. Spring arrived slowly, the ranch waking green and muddy, foals born in the same barn where Reese had first taught me to ride. We named one filly Dana, honoring the woman who had shaped Reese long before I ever arrived, a decision Reese made without hesitation. My old firm sent a formal offer, hoping I'd reconsider partnership remotely, and I declined it politely, finally certain of exactly where my life belonged. Reese's ranch income stabilized through a new writing lesson program I helped structure, blending her expertise with my forgotten talent for business contracts. Local families began enrolling their children for weekend lessons, the ranch slowly transforming into something the whole community felt ownership over again. One afternoon a young girl asked Reese if it was true two women could get married, and Reese answered simply, calmly, "Yes. And it's wonderful." The girl's mother, watching nearby, smiled instead of flinching, small evidence of a town quietly, gradually shifting around us. My mother arrived early for wedding preparations, bringing with her an old photograph of Louise, framed now, meant as a gift for our new home. "She should be remembered too," my mother said. "The same way you're honoring Dana. Love shouldn't disappear just because circumstances force silence around it." I hung the photograph beside Dana's in our living room, two women neither of us had met, quietly present in the life we were building. The morning of the wedding arrived clear and warm, mountains sharp against blue sky. The whole ranch decorated in wildflowers Reese had grown herself. Walt walked me down the makeshift aisle between the stables, insisting someone needed to hand off the city lawyer properly, laughing the entire way. My mother sat in the front row, openly crying, no longer hiding behind composure or control, simply present and proud in that single moment. Reese waited at the end of the aisle in a simple ivory shirt, Ember standing calmly beside her, decorated with wildflowers braided into her mane. We exchanged vows we'd written ourselves. Mine about trust learned slowly. Hers about love finally allowed to exist without constant fear attached to it. You taught me horses don't lie, I said. But neither do you. And that's the safest thing I've ever known in my life. Reese's voice broke slightly as she promised to keep making room. Not just for me, but for everything we still hadn't discovered together yet. The town gathered afterward for a celebration in the barn. String lights hung between rafters, laughter replacing every whisper that once lived there instead. My uncle didn't attend, but sent flowers. A small gesture that felt less like reconciliation and more like quiet acknowledgement of defeat. Reese's aunt danced with Walt, both of them laughing harder than anyone expected. The whole evening feeling stitched together from years of hidden grief finally healing. I caught my mother staring at the mountains during a quiet moment, and I asked if she was thinking about Louise again. I'm thinking, she said, that I finally did something right. Even if it took me 30 years and your stubbornness to get here. Late that night Reese and I stood alone in the barn, the celebration finally quiet. Both of us still in our wedding clothes. Ember threw you the same week I fell for you, Reese said. I think that horse knew exactly what she was doing the entire time. I laughed, admitting I'd never once regretted a single fall since arriving at this ranch. Not the horse. Not the heartbreak. None of it. A letter arrived weeks later from a stranger. A young woman from Ohio who had read about our wedding in a small regional paper. She wrote that seeing two women marry openly in a small ranching town gave her courage to finally come out to her own parents. Reese read the letter twice, then pinned it beside Dana's old photograph, saying some legacies mattered more than any land ever could. We expanded the writing program that summer, offering scholarships for local queer youth, something Reese said Dana would have insisted on immediately. My mother funded the first scholarship fully, quietly, without asking for recognition, her way of finally repaying a debt decades in the making. The ranch, once nearly lost to bankruptcy and secrecy, became something known statewide, not for scandal, but for community and quiet courage. Walt eventually retired from daily fieldwork, staying on as an advisor, insisting someone needed to keep the newlyweds from ruining good horses. Reese and I settled into a rhythm neither of us had known we were capable of. Ordinary mornings feeling like small, continuous miracles. I still practice law, now representing ranch families fighting predatory land developers. My old career transformed into something that actually mattered. My mother visited every autumn, learning slowly to ride herself, insisting each time that Ember liked her best, which Reese always denied loudly. On the third anniversary of our wedding, we watched Dana the filly, now grown, carry a nervous young rider through her very first lesson. Full circle, Reese whispered, watching the girl laugh with pure delight. The same delight I remembered feeling on my own first ride here. I realized then that fear, the one that had once ruled every choice I made, had quietly become something else entirely. Gratitude. Reese took my hand as the sun dropped behind the ridge, mountains glowing gold the way they had that very first stormy summer. No regrets, she asked, echoing words from years earlier. And I answered honestly that I had none. Not a single one. Not anymore. We walked back toward the house together, past the barn, past photographs of women who had loved fiercely before either of us arrived. The ranch stood steady behind us, no longer just land my grandfather sold or Dana's final resting place, but simply, finally, home. I thought of my mother's old regret, 30 years buried under safety, and felt profound gratitude that I had chosen differently. Chosen bravely. Reese squeezed my hand once, quietly certain, and said the ranch had never felt more alive than it did with both of us in it. Somewhere behind us, Ember and Dana grazed peacefully under the same darkening sky that once threatened to take everything from us both. I understood then that love, real love, wasn't the absence of storms. It was choosing to ride through them together anyway. Every hard conversation, every secret, every twist of fate had somehow led exactly here. To this porch, this woman, this unmistakable peace. I no longer measured my life in billable hours, but in mornings spent teaching frightened city strangers not to fear falling anymore. Reese often told new students that horses sense fear before riders even recognized it themselves, a lesson that had saved my own life completely. I told our story sometimes to nervous beginners, softened for polite conversation, though the real ending always stayed private, ours alone to hold. My mother once asked if I ever missed my old Chicago life, and I told her honestly that I barely remembered wanting it at all. Reese and I plan to expand the scholarship program again next spring, determined that no young person should ever feel forced into hiding. Walt joked that our porch had become wedding chapel number 2, after officiating 2 more ceremonies for couples the ranch had quietly welcomed since. I watched Reese teach a new rider that final afternoon, patient and steady, exactly as she had been with me that very first frightened day. The mountains hadn't changed, the barn hadn't changed, but everything inside both of us had transformed completely since that first nervous lesson. I finally understood what Reese meant that very first day. Horses don't lie. And neither, in the end, did the life we chose together. Years later, sitting on that same porch, I still believe the truest thing I'd ever learned came from a woman, a horse, and one terrifying first ride. Grace and Reese Calloway, together, home, unafraid, exactly where they always belonged. Andy.